In the spring of 1987, archivists at the South Carolina Historical Society were sorting through what was supposed to be a routine donation of old plantation papers. The boxes had come from a family estate being cleared after the death of its last descendant. Most of the materials were what you'd expect: faded receipts for cotton shipments, family correspondence, maps of land boundaries. But buried beneath these papers was something different. One archivist, a graduate student named Evelyn Moore, noticed a small trunk at the bottom of a stack. It was heavy, iron-bound, and sealed with a corroded lock that looked like it hadn't been touched in over 100 years. The trunk rattled faintly when moved, as if something inside had been waiting to be discovered. At first, Evelyn assumed it contained coins or maybe broken glass. But when the lock was forced open and the lid pried back, the room fell silent. Inside was a single leather-bound volume. The cover was cracked but intact, the spine embossed with no title, only the initials RR in faded gold leaf. The pages inside were remarkably preserved, protected by the trunk's tight seal. The archivists leaned in, expecting to see the usual plantation ledgers: accounts of rice shipments, inventories of tools, maybe a diary of weather patterns. Instead, what they saw made their stomachs turn. Every page was written in meticulous 19th-century script. Names filled the margins, but not the names of cotton buyers or rice traders. These were first names only: Sarah, William, Hannah, Elijah, followed by ages, heights, weights, and chilling notations in the margins: pairing completed, offspring yield satisfactory, docility rating high, projected labor value, $800. Evelyn flipped further. The same format appeared again and again. Births listed not as celebrations of life but as data points in a breeding program. Deaths noted with a brief line: malformed, reassigned. And scattered among the pages were financial calculations showing profit margins for what the author called improvements. These weren't farm records. They were human records, reduced to the cold arithmetic of a business model. The archivists looked at each other in disbelief. They were trained to catalog history dispassionately, but what lay before them wasn't a diary of crops or debts. It was a record of people deliberately paired, monitored, and bred for profit. A ledger of lives engineered to produce more lives. A system that transformed human reproduction into an industry. What made the discovery even more chilling was the precision. Every measurement, every trait, every so-called genetic improvement was tracked with scientific detail. The author wasn't some careless overseer jotting notes. He wrote like a researcher. He believed he was building something bigger, something systematic. And that was the realization that made Evelyn's hands shake. This wasn't the cruelty of one plantation owner. It hinted at an entire network. The ledger contained references to partner estates, to regional targets, even to quarterly projections. It wasn't just about what happened on one property. It was about what might have been happening across the South. The Historical Society had handled plenty of disturbing documents before. Slave sale receipts, whipping post inventories, advertisements for fugitive property. But this was different. This was colder. It revealed a strategy, a system, an institution within an institution. The ledger suggested that slavery hadn't only been about forced labor. It had also been about forced reproduction, calculated with the same precision as crop rotation and livestock breeding. The archivists quickly realized the sensitivity of what they were holding. Some of the surnames scattered throughout the correspondence were still among Charleston's elite. Families with streets named after them, families whose fortunes had built universities and foundations. If these pages became public, they would stain not only history but legacies that still wielded influence. And so, in that dimly lit room of the Historical Society, the decision was made to classify the volume for restricted access. Researchers could request it, but it would not be displayed, not be advertised, not be casually shared. Too many reputations were at stake. Too many people would rather this ledger remain in the dark. But secrets have a way of slipping into the light. And what this ledger revealed was more disturbing than anything even seasoned historians of slavery had encountered. It showed slavery not only as a brutal labor system but as a breeding system, one designed, calculated, and recorded in detail that makes the blood run cold. Before we continue with this story of how breeding farms operated during slavery, take a moment to subscribe to our channel. And in the comments, let us know where you're listening from. We love seeing our dark history community stretch across the world. What those archivists found that day was never meant to be read. It was supposed to stay locked away, buried under dust and family shame. Yet in their hands it became a key that opened a hidden chapter of American history, one where profit was measured not in bales of cotton, but in the bodies and bloodlines of enslaved people. And as investigators dug deeper into the records, they uncovered something even more unsettling. This ledger was not an outlier. It was a window into a larger system, organized, deliberate, and far more widespread than anyone dared to imagine. To understand the world behind the ledger, you have to step back into Charleston of the 1840s. At that time, the city stood as one of the richest ports in the American South, a place where mansions lined East Bay Street and horse-drawn carriages rattled over cobblestones worn smooth by centuries of trade. Charleston was elegant on the surface, but its elegance rested on a foundation of brutality. Every grand house, every lavish ball, every shipment of rice and cotton was built on enslaved labor. By the mid-19th century, Charleston's elite prided themselves on being not just wealthy planters but scientific innovators. They gathered at the Charleston Agricultural Society, a prestigious circle where gentlemen in waistcoats debated soil management, crop rotation, and livestock breeding. These were men who saw themselves as pioneers of a modern South, applying science to agriculture in ways that would impress Europe and rival the industrial advances of the North. But there was something darker hidden beneath the polished speeches and polite applause. In their journals and private letters, terms appeared again and again, phrases like labor efficiency, optimization, and long-term yield. To the outside world, those words sounded like farming strategy. Within Charleston's inner circles, they carried another meaning. These families weren't just talking about cotton and rice. They were talking about people. Families like the Ravenels, the Rutledges, the Pinckneys, and the Draytons dominated Charleston society. Their names carried power not only in South Carolina but across the South, tied together by marriages, investments, and long-standing political influence. They hosted glittering parties in candlelit ballrooms, where orchestras played European waltzes and guests danced in gowns of imported silk. But in the side rooms, behind closed doors, conversations drifted toward what they euphemistically called future labor management. One young man, Thomas Whitfield, a newly returned heir whose family had only recently acquired their wealth, attended these gatherings with a mix of fascination and unease. Having studied agriculture at Harvard, Thomas expected talk of crop experiments and soil chemistry. Instead, he overheard whispers about pairings, offspring value, and controlled improvements. At first, he thought he misunderstood. But as the months passed, the pattern became undeniable. The same men who bred racehorses and prize cattle with meticulous care were applying the same cold calculations to the people they held in bondage. And Charleston was the perfect setting for such an operation. Unlike smaller plantation towns, Charleston had the wealth, the scientific institutions, and the social structure to turn cruel ideas into organized practice. Doctors from the Medical College of South Carolina mingled with planters at society dinners, offering advice on health, heredity, and management. Professors from the College of Charleston quietly shared theories on improvement, lending academic legitimacy to what should have been seen as crimes. The ledgers from the Historical Society matched these whispers with chilling precision. On one page, a notation read, "Projected increase in height by 2 inches within 1 generation." Another listed desirable temperament traits, alongside family pairings. Each line reduced human life to data, proof that Charleston's elite had blurred the line between agriculture and humanity until there was no line at all. The city's prosperity made this possible. Charleston was flush with money from rice plantations along the Ashley and Cooper rivers, from cotton fields stretching inland, and from its position as a hub of the domestic slave trade. Ships carried goods out to Europe and brought wealth back in. That wealth built the marble columns and iron gates tourists still photograph today. But behind those gates, in candlelit studies lined with imported books, Charleston's most powerful families were planning something even more profitable than cotton: the systematic breeding of people. Publicly, these men spoke of honor, tradition, and stewardship. Privately, they used the language of science to justify what they were doing. Words like genetic improvement and selective pairing disguised the reality, forcing men and women into reproductive arrangements designed to produce children who could be sold for higher prices. It wasn't enough to own human beings. Now they sought to engineer them. What made Charleston so insidious was how normal it all seemed to its elite. Discussions about labor optimization slipped easily between debates about soil nutrients and crop yields. To visitors, it looked like intellectual sophistication. To those who could read between the lines, it was evidence of something far darker. For enslaved people living on these plantations, the shadow of this system would have been felt even if they didn't see the ledgers. Women found their movements monitored, their health scrutinized, their futures decided without consent. Men were moved between properties, praised for strength or punished for defiance. Children were watched not as sons and daughters but as future assets. In Charleston's parlors, the city's elite toasted to progress. In the fields and quarters, families lived under a quiet terror that their very bloodlines were being controlled. Charleston in the 1840s projected an image of refinement, polished manners, scientific curiosity, Southern charm. But the ledgers revealed what lay beneath the surface. Behind every chandelier-lit ballroom was a study filled with charts and calculations. Behind every smiling host was a man who saw people not as people, but as breeding stock. And what Thomas Whitfield, and later historians, would uncover was that this wasn't the eccentric cruelty of a few families. It was part of a larger design, coordinated, deliberate, and chillingly profitable. The next piece of the puzzle was hidden in the language of the ledgers themselves, in the way they described human lives not as stories but as numbers. And it's there that the disturbing picture becomes clearer, where slavery's cruelty was transformed into a science of cold, clinical calculation. When historians began studying the Charleston ledger, the first thing that struck them wasn't just the cruelty of what was written, it was the precision. Every page looked less like a diary and more like a scientific notebook. Columns lined with figures, margins filled with abbreviations, and entries that read like the results of an experiment rather than the record of a human life. Height, weight, chest measurement, temperament, compliant, resistance, moderate. These were the descriptors attached to enslaved men and women, written in the same detached tone that might describe the quality of corn or the sturdiness of a plow horse. Births weren't recorded as joyous events. They were logged as yields. Deaths were marked as losses. And scattered through the pages were comments that revealed the purpose behind it all. Offspring potential promising, bloodline compatible, genetic improvements noted. The word improvement appears dozens of times throughout the ledger. Not in reference to crop yields but to people. The author wrote of increased height averages over one generation, and lower resistance to instruction. In one chilling line, a child was described as premium stock, value doubled. In another, a woman was reduced to nothing more than breeding capacity above standard. This was not random cruelty. It was systematic. The handwriting revealed a man, or perhaps several men, who believed he was conducting research. The notes weren't careless scrawls but measured observations as if part of a larger study. And the deeper you read, the more obvious it became. Charleston's plantation elite were applying the same methods they used on livestock to the people they enslaved. To them, this wasn't brutality. It was progress. Agricultural journals of the time show that discussions of selective breeding were common among livestock owners. Farmers compared bloodlines of cattle, horses, and sheep with the aim of improving strength, fertility, or compliance. The ledger shows that those same principles were being transferred onto human beings, without hesitation, without shame, and with chilling efficiency. The involvement of medical professionals made it even more disturbing. Several entries reference consultations with doctors who examined enslaved women and men for suitability. Charts tracked menstrual cycles and fertility rates with the same precision used to measure rainfall or soil acidity. Instruments that should have been used for healing were turned toward control, ensuring that pregnancies occurred on schedule and that infants were born healthy enough to command high prices. Worse still, the ledger's calculations were not limited to physical traits. They included notes on personality. Docility, high. Defiant, reassigned. These shorthand assessments determined whether a person would be bred or sold off. To the enslaved, these words spelled the difference between remaining with family or being permanently separated. To the ledger's author, they were nothing more than variables in an equation. The coldness of the language makes the reality even harder to confront. Imagine being reduced to a single word in the margin of a book. Imagine your life, your identity, your humanity boiled down to stubborn or useful. Imagine your child described not as a boy or girl, but as yield. For the people whose names filled these pages, that was the reality. And yet, what makes the ledger uniquely disturbing is how ordinary it must have seemed to its authors. They didn't write with malice or rage. They wrote with the calm, careful tone of administrators and scientists. To them, this wasn't an atrocity. It was management. It was innovation. It was the future of plantation economics. One page even includes a comparison chart. The projected profits from cotton fields side by side with the projected profits from human improvement programs. The numbers told the story clearly. A single well-managed breeding operation, as the ledger called it, could yield profits 2 to 3 times higher than traditional agriculture. In a world where money meant status, it's easy to see why the practice spread among elite families. The ledger's survival into the 20th century is remarkable, because most planters who engaged in this practice had every reason to destroy evidence. Some scholars believe this book survived because its author truly believed he was contributing to science. To him, these weren't crimes. They were achievements worth recording for future generations. He saw himself not as a monster but as a pioneer. That delusion, that self-justification, may be the most chilling part of all. The men who created these records lived in fine houses, attended church, quoted scripture, and sent their sons to universities. They considered themselves gentlemen. They believed they were advancing civilization. And in the process they stripped people of identity and turned them into data points on a page. The ledger forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Slavery wasn't only maintained by whips and chains. It was also maintained by pens and ink. By the quiet calculations of men who never lifted a lash but whose handwriting bound generations into a system of control. By the language of science twisted into the language of oppression. And this was only the beginning. Because the ledger didn't stop at recording data. It pointed to a wider system, one that reached far beyond Charleston. Notes in the margins referenced partner estates, regional reports, and shared stock. What looked like isolated calculations in a single book were actually fragments of something larger. A network that treated human reproduction as an industry. And as we follow the trail of these entries, we begin to see how this hidden machinery expanded, how multiple plantations across the South coordinated their efforts, shared information, and profited from turning life itself into a commodity. The ledger's language was chilling enough, but what truly revealed the scale of this system were the descriptions of facilities, whole spaces constructed not for labor in the fields but for reproduction. These were not the rough slave cabins most imagine when picturing the quarters of enslaved people. The ledger describes buildings arranged in neat rows, built larger, with better ventilation, sturdier roofs, and cleaner interiors. At first glance this might seem like benevolence, but the purpose was not comfort, it was control. According to the records, these special quarters were designed to maximize birth rates. Women between the ages of 16 and 30 were housed in dormitory-style barracks, their health monitored daily. Charts noted weights, diets, menstrual cycles, and pregnancy statuses, all recorded with the same detached regularity as one would track crop rotations. Some entries even noted the use of tonics and sedatives, evidence that women were medicated not for their well-being but to regulate compliance and fertility. Inside one section of the ledger, a floor plan was sketched. 6 buildings arranged in a square around a central yard. One was labeled nursery, another medical, another quarters. It resembled a farm compound, but its livestock were human beings. The nursery held infants deemed premium, separated from their mothers within weeks of birth. These babies were cared for by attendants until they were old enough to be sent elsewhere in the network. The medical building was perhaps the most disturbing. The notes listed instruments acquired, including scales, calipers, and speculums. Devices used by doctors for study were repurposed to measure fertility and record development. The ledger noted monthly examinations, where women were checked and charted, their reproductive lives managed with clinical precision. Some entries describe corrective pairings, a phrase historians still debate, but most believe refers to forcibly reassigning women to different partners if pregnancies did not occur on schedule. Then there was the rotation of men. Strong, physically imposing men were moved from plantation to plantation, described in the ledger as studs. Their movements were carefully logged, ensuring genetic diversity while maintaining desired traits. The language is almost unbelievable. Cycle completed, yield satisfactory. These weren't fathers. They were reduced to tools, rotated like stallions, their humanity stripped away in service of the system. The quarters were designed to appear orderly and controlled. Cleanliness, food, and medical attention were provided at higher levels than typical plantation conditions, but not out of kindness. Healthy mothers meant healthy children. Healthy children meant higher prices. Every improvement was designed with one purpose: to make the business of human reproduction more profitable. The silence of these quarters is something survivors later spoke of. In oral histories recorded decades after emancipation, descendants remembered hearing that women were kept quiet, sedated in the evenings with herbal mixtures or laudanum. Communication was discouraged because where communication grows, resistance can take root. The ledger even contains a notation: compliance ensured by nightly draft. But what happened when children were born? The ledger makes that clear too. Newborns were evaluated immediately, assigned to categories like premium, standard, or reassign. Infants who matched desired traits, height, strength, docility, were marked for premium care, housed in nurseries with attendants. Others were listed as field-bound, meaning they would be raised only until old enough for labor. The coldest line reads simply, non-viable, disposed. It is not clear what that meant in practice, but the implication is chilling. For the mothers, the pain was unrecorded, but it does not take imagination to see it. To give birth, only to have the child taken within weeks. To see babies carried away to be raised by strangers. To know your body was not your own, that your future children would never be yours to keep. And yet, in the ledger's handwriting, there is no mention of grief. Only numbers. Only data. The breeding quarters reveal the truth. This was not improvisation or rumor. It was infrastructure. Entire buildings, staffed and supplied, dedicated to turning life itself into a commodity. The ledger does not describe lashes or chains, but in many ways, it reveals something even darker, a slavery of biology. The captivity of the womb. And what makes it unbearable is how ordinary it seemed to those who designed it. To the families who visited these compounds, they were not looking at horror. They were looking at investments. To them, this was progress, science, the future of their fortunes. They saw no contradiction between attending church on Sunday, discussing philosophy over dinner, and inspecting a nursery where infants were lined up like livestock. The breeding quarters stood as a grotesque mirror of Charleston society itself, polished on the outside, but built on a foundation of systematic control. Every child born there was already a ledger entry. Every woman was already a data point. And every family name attached to the project carried the weight of its profits and its crimes. But the ledger held one more revelation, proof that these operations were not confined to a single plantation or even to Charleston itself. Notes in the margins pointed outward, to a network that reached across state lines. A system where children, mothers, and fathers were shuffled like playing cards, traded across borders, and tracked in ledgers that stretched beyond South Carolina. And that is where the story widens. Because what began as whispers in Charleston drawing rooms grew into a multi-state machine, one that turned the forced reproduction of people into an industry more profitable than cotton itself. The Charleston ledger might have been found in one city, but its margins told a much larger story. Scrawled between the neat columns of births and pairings were notations that reached far beyond South Carolina. Words like Georgia stock successful, Virginia reports received, and North Carolina partners satisfied appeared again and again. This wasn't an isolated project hidden on a single plantation. It was part of a coordinated network, wealthy families across multiple states quietly sharing methods, people, and profits. The system worked like any other business consortium. Each plantation tracked its own improvements, then exchanged letters with partner estates. The correspondence, fragments of which survived in the ledger, described shipments of enslaved children labeled only with initials and ages. 10 boys, height average above standard. 6 girls, temperament docile. It reads like trade reports, but the products were human beings, sent across state lines to strengthen the genetic pools of other breeding farms. One of the most chilling entries detailed quarterly projections. Charleston's group calculated not only births on their own estates, but anticipated yields from affiliated plantations hundreds of miles away. The numbers were tallied together, showing collective profit margins higher than any individual farm could achieve alone. By pooling their resources, bloodlines, medical advice, and distribution networks, they had created something unprecedented. A multi-state enterprise where forced reproduction was as carefully managed as any cotton cartel. Georgia's records focused on size and endurance, Virginia's on temperament and obedience, North Carolina's on resistance to illness. Each region specialized, then shared results. Children born with the right traits were often transferred between states, strengthening the system as a whole. To the conspirators, this wasn't cruelty. It was efficiency. They congratulated themselves on innovation, as though managing lives like this were no different from managing crops. The profit margins explained why so many families participated. Cotton was risky, weather, pests, and markets could ruin a year's labor. But children born into slavery were assets that grew in value over time. A single successful pairing, as the ledger phrased it, could produce generations of enslaved laborers. Some calculations showed that a woman forced into these programs could yield profits equal to hundreds of acres of farmland. The system didn't just exploit labor. It monetized birth itself. The ledger revealed coordination not just between planters, but also with slave traders and even medical professionals. Letters referenced shipments arriving by river, timed to avoid federal scrutiny. Other notes mentioned consultations with physicians about improving conception rates. Doctors who should have been healers became silent partners, lending legitimacy to practices that stripped humanity from every person involved. Even more disturbing were the financial records. One entry showed that, in just 5 years, Charleston's group earned profits exceeding $300,000, a staggering sum at the time, by distributing enslaved children bread for specific traits. Another report bragged that breeding farms outpaced cotton by threefold, calling it the future of Southern prosperity. To them, this was not just a practice. It was a model for expansion. And expansion was exactly what they planned. The ledger referenced territories to the west, Mississippi, Arkansas, even Texas, as untapped opportunity. Land was cheaper there, oversight weaker, abolitionist influence less threatening. If the network could spread its operations westward, they believed the profits would be limitless. These were not idle dreams. They were mapped out with timelines, budgets, and letters of intent. The most disturbing part is how invisible it all was. Charleston citizens may have seen women move between plantations, children disappearing from families, or new arrivals with suspiciously similar features. But the machinery of the network was hidden in plain sight. The records used euphemisms like shipments or improvements, language that disguised horror as progress. Respectable families toasted to their success at dinner tables while the true source of their wealth remained hidden in locked ledgers. What the Historical Society discovered in 1987 was only one piece of this puzzle. Historians now believe dozens of similar ledgers once existed across the South. Most were destroyed deliberately, burned when the Civil War ended, or hidden away in family archives. But the Charleston book provided proof that this was not rumor, not abolitionist propaganda, but a coordinated system woven into the very fabric of Southern wealth. The existence of this network changes how we understand slavery. It wasn't just forced labor in the fields. It was forced reproduction, planned across states, calculated for profit, and executed with chilling precision. Every birth was an investment. Every child was inventory. And every family name attached to the system carried both the power it gave them then and the shame it carries now. But even in the cold precision of the records, there are hints of resistance. A notation reads, uncooperative, relocated. Another, escape attempt, terminated. These brief lines remind us that those trapped inside this system were not passive subjects. They fought in the ways they could, even when every detail of their lives was controlled. The ledger may have reduced them to data points, but behind every number was a person with a voice, a family, and a will to survive. The exposure of the network raises an unsettling question. If one ledger could reveal so much, how much more remains hidden? How many other families built their fortunes on breeding programs quietly erased from history? And how much of America's prosperity today still rests on the foundations laid by those calculated crimes? What we know is this: the breeding network was real, deliberate, and profitable. It turned Charleston into the hub of a machine that stretched across the South. And as we follow the trail into the years that followed, we see how powerful families went to extraordinary lengths to keep it hidden, destroying records, silencing witnesses, and shaping the story of slavery into something far less damning than the truth. If the Charleston Ledger revealed how widespread and profitable the breeding network had become, it also revealed something else: just how carefully its architects worked to keep it secret. For all their scientific language and business-like calculations, the men who ran this system understood one thing clearly: if the truth ever reached the outside world, it would destroy them. From the very beginning, the network operated under layers of euphemism and code. Where ordinary plantation ledgers listed births or deaths, these records used terms like yields and losses. Shipments of enslaved children were marked not with names, but with initials and numbers. Letters between estates often avoided direct references altogether, using phrases like deliveries received or arrangements complete. To anyone outside their circle, the words could be dismissed as normal plantation business. But to those inside, they carried an entirely different meaning. The secrecy extended to meetings. The ledger notes that plantation owners gathered at rotating locations, never the same estate twice in a row. These gatherings were disguised as agricultural society functions or social dinners, but once the doors closed, conversation turned to breeding schedules, exchange agreements, and distribution plans. Alcohol flowed, cigars were lit, and the language of commerce filled the air, except the commerce was human reproduction. Families invested in the network knew the risk of exposure. That's why the ledger was locked in a sealed trunk, its key kept separate from the volume itself. Other evidence shows that many such records were deliberately destroyed. Historians examining post-Civil War archives found unusual gaps, missing years in plantation journals, entire sets of correspondence burned. It appears that when the Confederacy fell, families rushed not only to preserve their wealth but to erase any trace of their involvement in systematic breeding. And yet, not all traces vanished. The Charleston volume survived because its author believed it to be a scientific achievement, something worth preserving for posterity. But most others were not so careless. By the late 19th century, families with names still prominent in Charleston society were lobbying historical organizations to restrict access to sensitive documents. They donated letters and ledgers, but only on the condition that certain items be kept sealed. To this day, some archives in the South contain restricted collections tied to these families, closed until specific dates or even indefinitely. The influence of these families extended beyond archives. In the early 20th century, local historians writing the official accounts of Charleston life glossed over or ignored any mention of breeding operations. Instead, they focused on architecture, social events, and agricultural innovation. The brutality behind the wealth was softened or omitted entirely. Tours of historic houses spoke of rice profits and elegant dances, but not of women housed in breeding quarters or children taken from their mothers. Even academia played a role in silencing the story. Medical colleges that had once lent legitimacy to the network later avoided acknowledging their involvement. Professors who had corresponded with planters on heredity studies were later celebrated as pioneers of Southern science, their darker contributions buried in footnotes or ignored altogether. This selective memory ensured that for more than a century, the true scope of the breeding network remained hidden in plain sight. But silence has cracks. Oral histories collected from formerly enslaved people in the 1930s, through the Federal Writers Project, contain scattered references to special houses and breeding quarters. Interviewees spoke of women being set aside and of children taken away young. At the time, many historians dismissed these accounts as exaggerations or folklore. Only after the Charleston ledger surfaced did those memories gain new weight. Suddenly, the voices long ignored were validated by written proof. What becomes clear is that the breeding network was protected not only by secrecy but by power. The men involved were judges, politicians, doctors, and landowners. They controlled newspapers, courts, and universities. If whispers did surface, they had the influence to smother them. And when the Civil War ended, they used that same influence to rewrite the history of slavery into something less damning, something that could preserve their social standing and pass unchallenged into the future. The discovery of the Charleston ledger shattered that silence. But it also raised uncomfortable questions. How many other ledgers were destroyed? How many remain hidden in attics, locked trunks, or family archives? How much of the truth has been deliberately buried by generations determined to protect reputations built on exploitation? The effort to keep this history hidden reminds us of a sobering truth. Power doesn't just control the present. It controls memory. It decides what stories are told, what records are preserved, and what horrors are allowed to fade. For over a century, Charleston's elite succeeded in hiding the darkest parts of their wealth. But no secret can stay buried forever. Because alongside their silence, there were always cracks. Survivors remembered. Descendants whispered. And a few records, like the Charleston ledger, slipped through the cracks, waiting for the day when someone would finally open the trunk, turn the pages, and expose the truth they were never meant to see. For decades after the Civil War, the breeding network survived only as rumor. Planters destroyed records, families denied involvement, and official histories ignored the subject altogether. But silence has cracks, and through those cracks, fragments of truth began to escape. The first cracks appeared in stories whispered within black families. Grandmothers told their children about the houses where women were kept apart. Descendants spoke of relatives who had been moved like cattle, or who bore uncanny resemblances to enslaved men known to have been sent from other states. These weren't polished accounts. They were fragments, half-remembered names, bits of overheard conversation, the kind of family secrets that linger in the background of memory. When the Federal Writers Project conducted interviews with formerly enslaved people in the 1930s, some of those fragments were recorded. A man in Georgia spoke of stock houses, where women were chosen for strength and breeding. A woman in Virginia described children taken from mothers within weeks, sent off downriver. Another recalled being told never to speak of the doctor's visits in the quarters. At the time, many white historians dismissed these testimonies as exaggerations. They didn't fit the sanitized narrative of slavery as a paternalistic institution. But decades later, when the Charleston ledger surfaced, those voices suddenly carried the weight of proof. One entry in the ledger matches almost word for word what a woman named Sarah Moses told interviewers in 1937. She said her mother was given a man she did not want, and that a baby was born and taken away. The ledger for the same year records, pairing completed, offspring yield satisfactory. Infant reassigned. It is one thing to hear the pain in Sarah's voice. It is another to see it confirmed in ink by the very men who orchestrated it. The cracks widened when genetic studies began in the late 20th century. Descendants who traced their ancestry often found unusual clustering of traits within certain regions, suggesting deliberate pairings over multiple generations. While genetics can never provide the whole story, patterns of height, build, and even medical conditions aligned uncannily with what the ledgers described. Families that had long suspected they were shaped by something more than chance began to see evidence written not just in documents, but in their very DNA. Then there were the physical remains. Archaeologists working on plantation sites occasionally unearthed foundations of buildings that didn't match typical slave cabins. Larger, more uniform structures with signs of medical use, scales, instruments, even glass vials. At first, these finds puzzled researchers. But once the Charleston ledger came to light, the pieces began to fit together. The so-called breeding quarters were not rumor. They were bricks and mortar, standing testimony to a system deliberately designed to manage reproduction. Descendants of Charleston families have also provided cracks in the wall of silence. Some, burdened by guilt or determined to uncover the truth, have opened private collections. Letters once tucked away in attics or hidden behind false drawers and desks surfaced in estate sales or were donated to archives. These documents often contained careful language, but the patterns were unmistakable. References to stud rotations, healthy stock, and partner exchanges matched the language of the Charleston ledger almost exactly. And then there are the stories that were never written down at all, stories passed in whispers, surviving only because they were too painful to forget. A woman remembering her great-grandmother's words, "We were not allowed to love, only to bear." A man recalling how his grandfather, born light-skinned and tall, was said to be chosen stock. Each memory standing alone might be dismissed, but together they form a chorus. And when placed beside the ledger, the chorus becomes undeniable. What makes these cracks so powerful is that they come from both sides. The enslaved remembered in sorrow. The enslavers remembered in secrecy. And every so often their two stories align. That alignment, oral testimony and written record speaking the same truth, is what makes the breeding network impossible to dismiss as myth. Yet even with the cracks, much of the story remains hidden. We know of one ledger. How many others were burned in fireplaces when Union troops advanced? How many letters were shredded by families desperate to protect their reputations? How many truths lie locked in trunks still sitting in Charleston attics, waiting to be discovered? The cracks in the silence remind us that history is never complete. It is a puzzle with missing pieces, some lost forever, others deliberately hidden. But every oral history, every fragment of a letter, every archaeological discovery widens those cracks, letting in light that the powerful tried for generations to block. And as more of the truth came into view, one question grew harder to ignore. What was the long-term legacy of these breeding farms? For the families forced through them, the trauma stretched across generations. For the families who profited, the wealth built on those births carried forward into banks, universities, and foundations that still exist today. Which leads us into the next revelation. The legacy of systematic breeding was not erased by the Civil War. Its effects ripple forward, etched into bloodlines, family histories, and the very shape of American society itself. When we look at the Charleston ledger today, its horror doesn't end with the names written in its pages. The true weight of the document lies in its legacy, a legacy that stretched across generations, shaping lives long after the ink dried, and leaving scars that remain visible even now. For the people trapped inside the system, the immediate legacy was trauma. Imagine being told that your body was not yours, that your relationships were not your choice, that your children were not your own. Enslaved women were forced to carry pregnancies arranged by ledger entries, and men were rotated like tools, denied the ability to form lasting bonds with their families. Children grew up separated from their mothers, raised in nurseries where their value was judged before they could even speak. These experiences weren't isolated incidents. They were structured, deliberate, and repeated across plantations for decades. That trauma did not vanish with emancipation. Freed families carried with them the memory of being treated as commodities, and those memories shaped how generations spoke, or chose not to speak, about the past. Oral histories often stop short, with elders refusing to describe certain details. The silence itself became part of the inheritance. Descendants of enslaved people still speak of gaps in their family trees, branches cut short when children were sold away, names erased when babies were listed in ledgers only as initials. But the legacy didn't stop with families. It reshaped communities. Breeding farms disrupted the natural structure of kinship. Whole plantations functioned with families fragmented, relationships controlled, and births engineered. In the aftermath of slavery, when freedom came, these fractured bonds made it harder for formerly enslaved people to reclaim lost relatives or rebuild family units. The ripple effects extended far beyond the Civil War, creating generational challenges that historians now recognize as part of systemic trauma. On the other side of the ledger, the families who profited, the legacy was wealth and influence. Profits from forced reproduction funded expansions of plantations, construction of grand houses, and donations to universities and churches. Some of Charleston's most celebrated institutions were, directly or indirectly, enriched by the network. Names carved into marble or written on plaques still carry the invisible shadow of breeding profits. And while generations of descendants inherited wealth, reputation, and political power, the families who had been commodified inherited silence, displacement, and pain. Even science carries this legacy. The language of the ledger, genetic improvement, yield, docility, did not disappear when slavery ended. Instead, it re-emerged in later movements, from eugenics in the early 20th century to pseudoscientific justifications of racial hierarchy. The mindset that people could be categorized, measured, and improved like livestock left scars not only on families but on academic thought itself. Universities that once lent credibility to breeding programs later became centers of eugenics research, proving that the ledger's ideas outlived the institution of slavery. Modern genetic studies have revealed echoes of the network in unexpected ways. Population clusters in the American South show unusual concentrations of traits, height, build, even medical predispositions, that align eerily with the selective breeding described in the ledger. While genetics alone cannot tell the full story, they provide another layer of evidence that lives were shaped not by chance, but by deliberate design imposed from above. The human body itself carries the marks of that system. Culturally, the legacy lingers in the myths surrounding slavery. For decades, apologists described plantations as paternalistic or even benevolent. But the ledger shatters that narrative. It shows slavery not as an accidental cruelty, but as a calculated industry that weaponized reproduction itself. It forces us to confront the reality that wealth in Charleston, and across the South, was not only built on stolen labor but on stolen futures. The most haunting part of this legacy may be how much of it remains hidden. For every ledger discovered, there are likely dozens more destroyed. For every oral history recorded, there are countless stories silenced by shame or fear. And for every name written down, there are thousands of lives erased by initials and numbers. We will never know the full scale. But what we do know is enough to understand that this system was not peripheral to slavery. It was central to it. Today, historians continue to piece together fragments, letters in archives, oral histories passed down, archaeological evidence uncovered in old foundations. Each discovery widens the cracks in the silence left by the powerful. Each one adds another piece to the puzzle of how systematic breeding operated and why it was hidden for so long. The legacy of the Charleston ledger is twofold. It reminds us of the cruelty people can normalize when profit is at stake, and it shows us the power of documentation to expose what was meant to stay hidden. For the enslaved, every birth recorded in the ledger was a loss of autonomy. For us, every entry is a reminder of lives reduced to data, but also a warning, how easily dehumanization can wear the mask of science, progress, and respectability. And as we stand at the edge of this history, one final question remains. Was Charleston unique, or was it only one node in a much larger system that we have barely begun to uncover? The Charleston ledger closes with a final entry dated 1849. The handwriting, steady and confident through hundreds of pages, ends abruptly after noting a series of births and pairings. No conclusion, no farewell. Just silence. That silence speaks volumes. It's as if the author assumed the work would continue, that others would carry the system forward, that the machinery of forced reproduction would outlive him. And in many ways he was right. The Civil War may have ended slavery, but it did not erase the structures built by ledgers like this one. Families who profited from breeding networks passed on their wealth, influence, and respectability. Universities, banks, and foundations grew stronger with donations made from profits earned in bloodlines rather than crops. Meanwhile, the descendants of those recorded in the ledger inherited gaps in their histories, questions without answers, and the weight of trauma carried forward in silence. The Charleston ledger forces us to rethink how we understand slavery. For too long, the story has been told as one of backbreaking labor in cotton and rice fields. That was true, but it was only part of the truth. The ledger reveals something deeper. A system where human reproduction itself became industrialized, measured, and monetized. Where women's bodies were reduced to breeding capacity, where men were rotated like tools, and where children were judged before they could walk. This was not accidental cruelty. It was deliberate design. The men who wrote these records didn't see themselves as villains. They saw themselves as innovators, using science to maximize efficiency. They used polite language, attended church services, and toasted progress at dinner tables. And yet, in their studies and their ledgers, they stripped human beings of identity and turned them into numbers. That contradiction, the mask of civility over the reality of brutality, is what makes the ledger so chilling. Today, historians still don't know how many similar records existed. Some were destroyed at the end of the war, others hidden away in attics or locked trunks, and still others buried by generations unwilling to confront the truth. The Charleston discovery may be only one glimpse into a much larger system, a system that spanned the South and shaped the lives of tens of thousands of people. Every lost ledger represents voices silenced, families erased, and crimes hidden from history. And yet, the survival of even one book matters. Because it proves what survivors always said, that breeding farms were real, that systematic control of birth was part of slavery, and that lives were engineered for profit. The ledger transforms rumor into fact, silence into testimony, and denial into accountability. It stands as evidence that can no longer be ignored. What makes the story of the ledger so powerful is not only what it reveals about the past, but what it demands of the present. It forces us to ask hard questions. How much of America's wealth rests on practices we have barely begun to confront? How many institutions still carry the benefits of profits earned through human breeding? And how many truths remain hidden, waiting for someone brave enough to open the trunk and read what was never meant to be read? The Charleston Ledger is not just a book. It is a mirror. When we look into its pages, we see the cruelty that can be justified when profit is placed above humanity. We see how science can be twisted into a tool of oppression, how respectability can cloak atrocity, and how power can silence memory for generations. But we also see the resilience of truth, how even after a century of secrecy, a single ledger can crack open a door that powerful families tried to keep closed. And that brings us here to you. The story you've just heard is not an easy one, but it is necessary. Because history isn't only what's written in textbooks, it's also what's hidden in trunks, whispered in families, and pieced together from fragments the powerful tried to erase. By listening, by learning, by refusing to look away, we honor those whose names were reduced to entries in a book, and we ensure their stories are not forgotten. So now we ask you, do you believe all of the truth has been uncovered, or are there still secrets locked away in Charleston's attics and archives, waiting to be revealed? Leave your thoughts in the comments. We read every one. And if this story shook you, share it with someone who needs to understand the darker side of America's past. If you haven't already, subscribe to the channel and join our community of dark history investigators. Because there are more hidden truths, more disturbing discoveries, and more untold stories that we'll uncover together. Until then, remember, the past is never as far away as it seems.